All right. I'm Connor.
And I'm Jack.
And you're listening to another episode of the Building Better Dungeons podcast. More of a return to our roots. We're not going to have any... None of our faces here, and the editing is going to get sloppier. It actually won't be a still static image, because YouTube actually hates those. Like, it algorithmically depresses them. Mm-hmm. So there'll be some pretty pictures.
But otherwise, welcome to lazy boy hours.
Yes, no. With our exams coming up, there is going to be a video or two of lower production value, but come like the second week of May, it'll all be back to normal. So we are down on production, but we're, if anything, up on high quality brain ideas. Yes, it is.
It is big brain time here. 3:25 a.m.
3:36 a.m. The time it ever flies. We just actually recorded. So this episode is all about how to personalize your Dungeons & Dragons campaign. Jack, why would you want to personalize your Dungeons & Dragons campaign anyway? Doesn't that make you sound pretentious?
I just needed to filter out the vulgarity from what I was about to say. But it's such an awesome and special connection you can have with your players if you are running a game you've never run before and your players are getting to experience a brand new game. Because D&D... With Dungeons & Dragons, it's very easy to fall into the same tropes. And those tropes can be fun. I love a good tropey campaign. But it's, all too often players can find themselves trying to emulate Lord of the Rings or something like that that's been done before. Whereas you can have a really fun and really unique experience when you build your own campaign from your own experiences and your own memories and your own perspectives. And it's even better then because your players don't know what to expect. If your players know to expect, Tolkien high fantasy, then that kind of sometimes sets them up for disappointment when Gandalf the White comes back as Gandalf the Greyish and not, the regular one, just because you had some unique ideas. If your players and you aren't on the same page about them, that can be a bit of an upset, a bit of a disappointment. But if you guys go into this knowing, hey, we're going to be running a totally unique campaign that's never been done before because it's all me and it's all you, then that can lead for some fabulous times.
But isn't personalizing your D&D campaign hard? I mean, what if I'm a new player? Shouldn't I be just doing everything as by the book as possible? Isn't it going to take me massive amounts of effort to try and weave my own soul into the game that I make? Making the game's hard enough when it's made by rote. Like, running the game from an adventure book can be tricky enough.
No, doofus. You're right. Running the game from the books is already difficult. You have to read the player's handbook to know how the game rules work, the monster manual if you want to have any monsters, the DMG if you want to actually know how the game rules work, and then Xanathars and Volos if you want to actually have any variety in those monsters that you get to play. That's a heck of a lot to be running. But you can actually kind of cheat a little bit. The rules of the game are large, and especially when it comes to stuff like monster stat blocks and player rules and that kind of thing, there's a lot to deep dive into, but you can actually... The whole point of this channel is to take a step back from the big, meaty words of the game and try and understand things conceptually. Normally we use the colors for this, where if you understand what a blue campaign looks like, if you understand what a blue villain looks like, then you can really get a feel for what they're going to act like, even without knowing their rules and their past and their languages and their senses and what recharge abilities they have. So you can apply that sort of same thinking to your entire campaign, and instead of using the system of Magic the Gathering colors, you can use the system of memories and experiences you already have.
The whole raison d'etre of this channel is to really give you as many different lenses to view Dungeons & Dragons from as possible, because the more tools in your tool belt, the better tooler you are. So we have a couple of real simple questions you can ask yourself, real simple ways to make sure that the campaign you're running is personal to you. And the first one is really simple. What is one thing that you remember about your hometown, the place that you grew up? Now, this might seem a bit arbitrary, but stick with us for a second. I'm from a town. It borders on... There's a river that runs through it, and one side of the town is called Greg-na-Manna, which is probably weird for all you poor Americans. And the other side of the town was called Tinninch. And actually, that other side of the town was technically a different county. In Ireland, we don't have states, we have counties. And it's not like America at all. If you're wondering, if you're in Australia and you're wondering why I'm talking to the Americans, it's because the demographics showed 54% of our audience. So I was just making sure you understand, Ireland's a small enough country. We have different counties, but the counties are like, I don't think they're even really like counties in America. I think counties are generally quite small. We do have some big ones. Cork is big. But regardless, what I'm trying to say here is that my hometown had one school, but the school had students from 2 different towns, 2 different counties. Obviously, they were right beside each other. Like, there are kids who live like a stone's throw away from each other. But technically, they were on opposite sides of this river. They were on opposite sides of these town lines. And so my school experience was actually really divided. There was like 2 distinct groups. There was the Graignamanagh lads and the Tinnahinch lads. I went to an all-boys school, so no gals. But that was like a really interesting thing that like was a part of my experience in that town for its entire conception. Like, obviously, there was no real bullying. It wasn't like lads from one town were constantly like raising hell for lads in the other. But it was this interesting kind of tribalism that was always really very, very apparent. Like, people sat together, people like played together. You were rooting for people from your own environment. And then there was these kids caught in the middle. We had like a lot of people who bust in from more rural places than the small country town. And those people were sort of on the outside looking in at this very strange and pretty needless division. And it's all just because of how like the geography worked out, how the county lines ended up being drawn. I mean, Graignamanagh and Tinnahinch are about as connected as any 2 towns could reasonably be ever. So that means that with this experience, I often inject that into D&D campaigns. It's something that I often add in my world building. A town or a village that is actually 2 towns or villages. And the villagers might not have a lot to disagree over, but that is how they orientate their lives. Like, when they think about themselves in respect to the world, that division of my town and the other town is really apparent. And it's the kind of thing that players can bounce off of when they encounter people. They might find that some people are very happy to have everyone around, and there are some people who really, like, even though they are neighbors, they're people who are a stone's throw away, have a lot of distrust for them. That's an interesting energy that I like to inject into my campaigns. And it's something that came about from something I noticed about my hometown. And you might think to yourself, well, how unique is my hometown to me? A lot of people went to, like, grow up in my hometown, but not all of the people noticed the specific thing that you thought of first. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people thought in Graignamanagh, that kind of tribalism, or that sort of 2 towns in one vibe wasn't the biggest thing that they thought of when living there. The kind of thing that you notice is to do with your perspective. And so when you're actually injecting your perspective into the game when you run it like this.
Sorry, you finish.
Is there anything from a place that you grew up, Jack, that you think is fertile ground for this kind of discussion?
So, when I was young, I used to go to school, I suppose.
Wow, crazy. That's so unrelatable.
I suppose middle school for the 54% of the audience, and primary school. Anyway, I used to spend Monday to Friday with my mom in, a fairly well-developed town, and then I'd spend the weekends with my dad out in the country. And that's, look, a lot of kids grow up with that sort of memories of having, bouncing back and forth from house to house. But the specific thing that kind of hit me was how different those 2 worlds were. You had sort of suburban versus rural. On the weekend, I'd be on the back of a tractor driving up the side of a mountain trying to catch sheep who'd run over the county lines.
For you Americans, that mountain is about a molehill.
We're talking maybe 200 meters above sea level.
The definition is literally different in our country because we wouldn't have any other mountains if we were using yours. We wouldn't have any mountains at all, rather.
And then I come home from that to a town that was big enough to have, shops, and there was a little sort of mall area and that kind of thing. And so that sort of divide, that harsh contrast of flicking back and forth can really, like, one of the first things that kind of comes to mind to evoke that feeling is a D&D world that is constantly changing. So, taking myself as the center of the world, as the origin, was less, I was moving around the world, and what if more the world was moving around me? So we'd have a world that was bright and progressive and full of technology half the time, and then the other half the time, when the night falls, the everyone would hide inside their doors away from the monsters of the night, and everything would become a lot more guarded and conservative, and people who would have said hello to you during the daytime are all of a sudden too afraid to meet your gaze during the nighttime because of God knows what else is out there. Maybe you're one of the monsters out there.
I see. Yeah, that is interesting. The whole sort of Matt Colville, another DM. If you're listening to our channel, I mean, the odds are literally 100% that you know who Matt Colville is. I mean, even if you are our friend Hannah, who listens to these just because she enjoys my company personally, you've heard of Matt Colville, right, Hannah? Like I've told you about him before. Anyway, he likes to structure his whole game world around the central tension of like society and civilization versus nature and order. And that's actually where I thought you were going. No, you have a sort of a different vibe of just like it's the actual change, it's the turbulence of living in your fractured, broken home that stuck out to you.
You don't have to hit the nail on the head, Dan.
It's okay. I'm not going to talk to him about how how those people ended up where they are now. Anyhow. What about the place you grew up sticks out to you, and what in it can you use for your Dungeons & Dragons campaign? My one actually is too. I grew up in a pretty interesting town, Greg, but one of the things that it is twinned with a similar town in French, in France, not in French. I actually don't know the name of that town, but the idea is they were both sort of monastery monk towns. And so Greg Mountain now has a bunch of very, very eerie, bespoke statues of monks carrying various implements, some of which are weapons, and they're just littered around the place in kind of random spots. I like to walk by the river quite a lot. It's a really nice scenic view. But there's just a bunch of stone monks there now standing vigil over the whole thing. And at night time, it can be a bit spooky to sort of see these stone resolute, like these still figures, and not realize that they're actually just statues, to be like, oh man, that person is very still. And that implementation of danger into architecture or like generic presences, that's the kind of thing that I think will be interesting in a D&D campaign. What if you had a D&D campaign where, statue work could be the actual thing. Like there might just be a lot of statues around from an old civilization, and some of them are actively harmful or evil or maybe even good, but they have agency. Not all of them, not most of them, but some of them. Or you could have, to try and capture the feeling a different way, some of the trees are just angry and hateful and will try and I was about to do a swear word. And these videos aren't for kids, but profanity is bad for the algorithm, I'm sure. There are trees that are willing to mess you up if that's what they think needs to happen. This idea of injecting a little bit of threat into common, everyday stuff that should be safe is a way to cultivate a very particular feeling. But that's our first hint. That's our first tip, and it's a real simple one to make sure that your own perspective gets woven into your game, because the stuff that you notice, the stuff that sticks out to you, is stuff that you are inclined to notice that maybe not everyone else would. So it is a good way of injecting yourself into it. What is our second tip, Jack? Or do you have any other notes on that one?
This is not a heavily scripted episode, and as such, I've forgotten what the script was. Yes, I do know.
I'm proud of you.
So I just want to follow on from what Connor said. Sometimes your town is going to have something interesting about it geographically that is you would maybe want to port 1-to-1 into the game. So the idea of these statues that represent an ancient monastery of monks, you could literally just throw that 1-to-1 into the game. So you can be
the village being twinned with the village in France. You could put that 1-to-1 into the game.
But you have no idea how many no players appreciate. But not all towns are going to have something that you can port easily into it. So you might be looking back through your memories and think, oh, well, there's nothing interesting about my hometown. But it's specifically the perspective and the feelings that it evoked in you. So when Connor was talking on past that, he was talking less of the realism of having the statues around and more of the feeling of like, well, what other creatures or what other facilities? What other things could you put in your world that bring across that sort of menacing energy that the statues have? What can evoke that feeling in your players that you felt in your hometown all those years ago?
I feel like I could actually do an entire podcast on how to port Greg the Mana and the feelings that I had for it, because I just realized now, in the early part of my childhood, people were really spooked about letting the kids walk to school because there was trucks, big, heavy goods deliveries trucks that would be going through the main street of Greg the Mana, causing a lot of traffic, but also like their maneuvering wasn't great, and it was pretty dangerous for the kids walking to school. And so the town pitched hard for a bypass to be introduced, so Greg the Mana could be skipped by these goods delivery trucks. And that didn't really get anywhere for a while, because in Ireland we're not very motivated by child safety. We have a lot of 11-year-olds on tractors, like doing the driving. I know several farmers' children who have crashed tractors before, and it's just very normal here. I'm not sure, maybe it's like normal in like rural America too. Who knows? Not us, and we refuse to ask, and don't tell us in the comments that they're here. But what ended up winning in the end was the church stepped in, because the foundations of the beautiful abbey we have in Great Mana were getting like shooken and rattled and like damaged by all the goods delivery trucks coming in. Like people came in, architects, and said, no, this doesn't work. This is like this church will collapse if this continues. And apparently the church has enough power in the place that we are that it gets to just reroute things. Like it just got to basically tell the government to build a road, and they did. And it's a good road. Like it was sensible as a building decision, but I don't know if that decision would have been made without the influence of the church. And it's not like we have a huge church presence in Great Mana. Like it's there. There's like priests and such, but like I don't think double digits of them. So that sort of almost alien presence of like there is a force watching over the town is also an interesting thing to put into your D&D campaign, but it doesn't have to be a church. It could be an angel or a devil or a bunch of woodland spirits. Anyone with a vested interest in like a particular group in the town who isn't there all the time. That's an interesting dynamic for any village. Or city, or like entire continent, I suppose. But yeah, I'm going to move on from Greg the Mana. This is not the Greg the Mana podcast.
So the next thing we wanted to chat about a little bit is, so you're a person. Okay, bear with me for a moment. You're not just some algorithm watching this video.
Where's the X that I can press to down?
You're not just some algorithm reading this video to see if it's a good idea to post ads on it. You're a person who has their own skills and their own interests, and though those skills and interests might not obviously overlap with D&D at first glance, there's still probably a lot of things you can bring over into that. So a Dungeons & Dragons campaign run by an avid chemist is going to be very different to one run by an eager engineer.
Or I mean, it might not be. Both those people could play a very by-the-books style. But if you are taking the skills from your discipline of choice, like from the thing you're studying in university or college or school, or the thing that you are doing in your everyday life, if you apply that lens to the world you create and the characters you make and the content you produce, then interesting stuff can happen. Oh, sorry, I think I interrupted you in a thought there, Jack. What were you saying?
Oh, no, it's fine. I rarely have thoughts. Okay, so you're 4 years into a failing engineering degree. Let's just, hypothetically. A perspective you can bring to the world is, if you have this information and knowledge and interest in a sort of a technical or a mechanical field, you can bring that into D&D by saying, well, actually my Dungeons & Dragons campaign is going to be a little bit more like the Mortal Engines, where there's going to be big, massive moving cities, and actually all the characters are going to be born on one of these cities and never have touched the real ground, and everyone's going to have an innate understanding of how to climb through the boiler works such that they can get past the governing mechanisms and able to be into the fuel depository. And so your players won't need to have an understanding of all of that necessarily. If you have a good grasp of it, you can present it to them in such a way that's to find it engaging and interesting, where maybe if they don't have such a knack for the mechanical stuff, you can lay off on that and maybe just know it in the back of your head of like, they think they're being clever trying to reroute the boiler pressure over here, but I know that actually that's connected to a release valve and it's not going to work. And maybe if they get a high enough roll, you can bring it back around and be like, oh, but what if instead the engineer who was on that day didn't install the release valve correctly, so it is going to cause that catastrophic failure, and then your players get to feel real smart because you're real smart on this particular topic.
And I'd say like it's not that you're expecting the players to know these things, it's that when their character, the players have a good idea, by all means reward them, but don't demand that they do. If there's a character who's high intelligence who rolls well, who's like, oh, am I able to use the pneumatic pressure here for something? And they roll well, then you're able to reward them, but you don't just say the word yes. You say the word yes, and here's why. And that kind of justification can go a long way. Like the same way, I've got a background in chemistry, but more importantly, I've got a background in just saying things to people in a vaguely convincing way, which is all you really need to be in a TM, I found.
We've both fostered careers off of saying things to people in vaguely convincing ways.
Well, I don't think this is a career just yet. I mean, it could be. But yeah, I mean, so the same idea of any sort of alchemy nonsense. If people are trying to produce, make a potion to save some poor girl who's been mauled to death by a griffin, and you can't get access to all the ingredients, there might be can I have a check to see if something else would be a decent substitute? And if you know any of the chemist lingo, then you're able to say something outside of the word just yes. That's very technical and very specific, this whole line of inquiry right now. One thing I think most interested to be used a little bit more generally. So one of the things that I am super into is like politics and political theory. I really enjoy and politics is in the structure of people together, like how societies are engineered. Like, is neoliberal capitalism a good and efficient way to run things, or how does it line up against like a more welfare state oriented capitalism, or like full on state socialism? Like, how do all these things match up with each other? What's a fascist state like? Oh God, no! We said the fascist word. The algorithm will hate us forever.
I will genuinely beep that
out. So this is something that I often explore in Dungeons and Dragons. I read an excellent Reddit post. I don't know if I'll be able to find it, which was about how elves, as an aggressive empire who were militaristic, would be terrifying. That person assumed that elves have like kids the same level that regular people do, because it didn't say otherwise in that they have kids at around a human level, but that also that they are still vaguely immortal, very long lived. So the idea was that there are so many elves, they're all basically experts at everything. Was his framework. And I didn't exactly copy that over full force, but I did think to myself, elves are in a good position to create this fascist empire. It makes sense for them to think that they are genuinely a superior race, because they are quite good at a lot of stuff, and then other races seem like a flash in the pan to them, or they seem to narrow in their interests. Elves do really want to go out and improve themselves, but they're also quite community focused. So it made sense to me. I created an elven empire, the Lepidia Agrippnia, I think I called it. And this was an empire of fascist elves who were going around the place colonizing people and doing it under the thin veneer of it being for their own good. So, that campaign you guys were based on, the continent was called Loahoru, and you were a part of the halfling human empire, the Florissant Main. And you guys the Florissant Main had, gotten there first, technically. There was indigenous peoples, lizard folk and such. But the Florissant Main had gotten there and built some nice enough towns and villages. And the Agrippian came and say, "Oh my gosh, our empire is so superior to yours. You don't even have real brick roads here. We'll sort that out for you." And then they sort of took a lot of political control. All of a sudden, the people in the Florissant Main, the mainlanders, as they call themselves, weren't really in control of their own lives, and there was a bit of a rebellion. Not a very successful one. The fascist elves were really good at cracking this whole thing down. And so they were a constant presence throughout the campaign. And at one point, very early on, you guys were attacked by some illegally and managed to keep one or two prisoner. And you were sort of interviewing them about the way that they thought about the world. And one of them in particular was a musician, and there was a bard in our party. And the bard kept talking about how your society is so devoid of self-expression. Like, you're not able to express yourself properly. You have to fall in line with the state. And the fascist elf didn't see anything wrong with that at all. He was like, there's an infinite ways for me to express myself in my putting my adulation of the state into song. I think all of the shades of the human spirit can be found in kissing up to the state. And that was just because I'm interested in political systems, I was able to render that one pretty well for the players. The players got a good sense that the elves were happy in the society they lived in. The society was pretty awful from their point of view. And there was a series of communist dwarves, a monarcho-communist dwarves. And that's just that's the kind of thing that I like. I like rendering novel political systems and having players run into them and see this is an interesting way to structure society. How do we feel about this? With my most recent campaign, one of my players decided that he didn't like the sort of corporato-monarchism that the dwarves were working. Where it was ostensibly a meritocracy, but really whoever got in there first and established the connections got all the benefits. They didn't think that was very fair. And so they tried to install a democratic uprising. And that just went terribly. They didn't do a great job of it. But it really, it added a fun color to the campaign.
Oh. Yeah, I suppose the point we're trying to get at here is there's almost definitely something that you know a bunch about and that you'd be really good at describing or implementing in the campaign. And it just might not be obvious to you how to use it, but just kind of roll with it for a little bit, see what works. I mean, stuff like politics is really obvious to see how that goes into D&D. It's like, oh, well, so long as I have a kingdom and another kingdom, yeah, there's the politics. That just happens now. So yeah, just if you have the know-how, if you have the skills, if you have the experience, just work it into the campaign. You have basically enough knowledge that you're able to answer any of your players' questions, and you're able to make the world feel really deep and really textured. It's like a great artist is able to describe their world really well, but they're not going to know all the nitty-gritty details. Only people who have the skills and knowledge in those fields are going to be able to know those nitty-gritty details. And that's something that's a description you can bring to your campaign that nobody else can.
And because D&D is all about communication and information presentation, like that's what being a DM is first and foremost. You can be the best DM in the world, but if you're not able to communicate your ideas, if you can't tell the players where they are and what's around them, then they're going to have a frustrating time. So even just having the language from a field can be really important. Like I'm big into music. I know my music theory pretty well. I perform and record all the music that we got going on this channel. I'll put a piano chord in here probably. That wasn't me. Wasn't it good? And that's not super useful for D&D. I did have designs to compose a bunch of stuff like character themes. And as soon as my exams are over, I'll probably get right back on that because that sounds pretty fun right now. But the vocabulary that's used to describe music theory is pretty interesting, and often it's stuff that I lean into when I'm trying to describe sounds to players. Just like talking about dissonance or tension, or using the word. Oh, no, okay, I touched the microphone. Oh God, it's ruined. Using the word color a lot. I listen to a lot of Adam Neely. He's got a lot of great YouTube videos and podcasts you can check out. And he talks about how to describe sounds, that sounds are open or closed, they're narrow, they feel wide, maybe they're sparse, maybe they're sort of platonic sounding. There's a lot of terminology in music that you can drop in to color your language that I find works really well. That's also I find that chemistry terms also pop into things are. I don't know actually if I can even name a specific example.
Acidic.
Yes, things are acidic, and that's bad. I mean, there is actually a lot of acid in my campaign. I realize stuff tends to be rotted away in particular ways. There's lots of you guys remember that dwarven tomb you encountered where the whole thing was like a rotted tooth.
Yeah.
And I just had the vocabulary to describe the effervescence, the fizz, the mottling that was going on there. Yeah, no, it's even just vocabulary. You might not find your geographical or geological rather degree to be super relevant to D&D, but you have a lot of different words to describe minerals now. So I mean, employ them at will. You'd be surprised at the kind of color they can add to a campaign. We only prepped these two, so now we're in the complete dead zone. Who knows what's going to happen now? So the third one that I would recommend is finding the things you really enjoy that your players haven't heard of. That's the third way to personalize stuff to you. Again, you might say, I mean, how exactly is this personalizing it to me? Lots of people enjoy the thing that I really enjoy that my players haven't really heard of. But it's the fact that you are choosing this thing and leaning into the things you like about it. So my example for this is Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which is, according to my boyfriend, the best Star Trek series. I mean, not the one he enjoys the most, but when I asked him what kind of Star Trek I'd enjoy, he was like, well, DS9's the good one. So we watched it, and it is a good one. And it's a good one because politics is right and center. There's an interesting political situation. You have, this was actually the campaign I described earlier, this was really the basis of it. There is a group of people who have just escaped colonization by a fascist empire, suddenly finding that they are at the epicenter of a very important and special resource. And how to navigate this political situation of the fascists who just left, signed a treaty with all the world governments to agree to leave, and now want to come right back. And that all the political tension stuff there is really, really interesting, and I was able to use like really directly in the world building. And it was stuff where I had a lot of fun, say, translating societies from Deep Space Nine into the world. A lot of like the writers have done a really good job of setting them up in a way where they could contrast and conflict with each other in very interesting ways. And from my player's point of view, I had just rendered a complete, beautiful world full of civilizations that were all pitch perfect. And it was only when one of them started to watch the show a couple of months into the running the game where he was like, gosh, this is all just directly Star Trek Deep Space Nine, isn't it? 1-to-1.
Just stolen. Thievery.
But my favorite part of that show was actually the Trill, which was this really interesting, vaguely humanoid species who had a couple of parasites. And the parasites were like essentially immortal little alien boys, or well, they were genderless. And the Trill would compete with each other to see which one were the most worthy to have the parasite put inside them. And then all of a sudden, the parasite was like fused with that person. It was a whole symbiote type deal. And so we got to see Jadzia Dax, and Jadzia was the girl who had trained all her life to pass all the tests and be worthy of the Dax symbiote. And the Dax symbiote had 7 other lifetimes that it could recall and call back on and use to help Jadzia out in different situations. And I thought that was a really interesting idea, and I ended up leaning really heavily into it and how I implemented mind flayers. There was like a colony of mind flayers who had landed from like their Spelljammer ship off-world, and they had crashed onto Aloha and they realized, to their horror, that everyone around them was sentient. Where they were from, the other life forms like actually weren't sentient at all, and they were devouring them was fine. They were really like horrified to find out that their only food source here was living people, and so they had to kind of change the game up. So instead of having a complete ceremony where they would put the little tadpole inside you and you'd become a mind flayer, they did a different sort of situation where, like the Trill, you would be joined with the mind flayer. You'd become a half mind flayer, half whatever you were, and it had a lot of health benefits. And they were saying, this is the best compromise to keep our civilization going. And there was a lot of like tension from the party because they the players knew that mind flayers are evil, and that it was probably all a trap just to get people vaguely sympathetic and trusting of them, and then take over later on. There was some interesting mind flayer politics that came up, but that was something I really enjoyed the Trill, and then I was like, how can I implement this in D&D? And then I created a really like pretty novel take on mind flayers. That people got to interact with mind flayers in a much friendlier way than heroes usually get to do. And it's all just because I liked a TV show, but I didn't just like the TV show. I liked specific things about it. I liked the construction of its world building and how it handled this particular alien race. And so I took those things in, and they were big successes. And you've definitely got stuff you enjoy. Like everyone, most D&D players like Skyrim. Most D&D players have at least a passing familiarity with Lord of the Rings. But there's probably stuff that you like that is a bit specific to you. I mean, particularly stuff that you read or consumed as a kid. Because if you remember that stuff, then that's probably had a bit of an informing aspect as to like the kind of person you are now. Like if you remember stuff from when you were 6, you remember it for a reason. So that's definitely quite personal to you. Do you have anything like this, Jack?
Actually, just talking about it. So when you're pulling from your own hobbies and media you've consumed, books you've read, TV shows you watched, you can go super broad or you can go super specific. You can literally port ideas in 1-to-1. You can put the Trill in your game and just call them the mind flayers because that makes sense aesthetically to work through, and like people can engage with that and have a load of fun with that. We that was a wild ride of a campaign, I'll tell you what. But also you can go for sort of like larger stuff. So the thing actually that hit me most recently is I'm watching this little bit of an obscure anime. It's called JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. I doubt you've heard of it. Very common trope in that is that the magical superpowers that the heroes have don't make mechanical sense. They do things and they're not necessarily justified, but they mostly make narrative sense. And this is the idea I've been trying to bring into my games, the games I've been playing, where it's... So you've got this... there's this guy, the boss, and his magical power is called King Crimson. And there's a big trope about nobody knows exactly how it works. Narratively, though, everybody understands it from watching what should be happening. His whole thing is he skips through time. He skips time forward, and for him, it's as for him, he gets to see all the time that happens, but he doesn't get hurt by any of it. So, if our main good guys throw a punch, he can skip past the punch. He can watch the punch happen and dodge out of the way. But from our main character's point of view, it's just click and, oh, he's disappeared and my hand is over here now. What's happened?
The reason it was so confusing for people in the anime was that it was a mechanic built for the manga. The whole shtick behind it is that King Crimson can rip a page out of the Japanese comic book, and he's the only one in universe who knows what happened on that page. So the page still happened, because from now that you were reading a book with the page torn out, it goes from one event and just jumps to another. And King Crimson's the only one who gets to see the content of the page. Everyone else, it's like a little piece of time has been cut out. But they translated this quite cavalierly into the anime adaptation. So there's a lot of how exactly does this work? This isn't the comic book anymore. What's happening?
This leads to there being a lot of mechanical inconsistencies and it being difficult to pin down exactly what it does. But from a narrative point of view, everybody understands that, stand goes and time is skipped. Nobody's confused about that part. And that's specifically the aspect I like to bring into my games. So a sort of homebrew system we were playing, my character had a special stand. That I just ripped one from one. But its whole thing was it could stop you from touching something. Whatever it touched, you couldn't touch. You couldn't touch. You couldn't touch. Whatever it laid its hand on. And there's a lot of mechanical, baggage with that. With the idea of something that's touching something no longer being allowed to touch something, so technically gaining infinite impulse instantly. But that's fine. Because who cares about the mechanics of it? Who cares about the technical physics and laws of stuff? What's interesting to me and what's fun to me is the narrative of it. It's just the narrative says you can't touch the thing. Oh, well, this thing's actually connected to this other thing, so, if I can't touch my hand, can I also not touch my arm? Blah, 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 blah. Chill. You just can't touch it, alright? It's fine. And I actually really like that sort of energy where you don't have to be worried about the mechanics of it. You can just bring on here's how it works. Nobody knows why it works. Nobody knows the minutiae, the chemical reactions, the physical machinations. It just does what it says on the tin.
Yeah, that's actually something that's a bit of a shame sometimes about magic items in D&D, is they don't always feel especially magical. They're always tools that work in very specific ways. And the Identify spell tells you absolutely everything you need to know about a thing rules is written, except whether or not it's cursed, what the effects of the curse might be. And I think that's kind of a shame. I think it's just unfortunate to have this level 1 ritual mean that all of the magic gets zapped out of the magic items. I like the idea of trying to inject a bit more dream logic into stuff. And that is something that JoJo's Bizarre Adventure does pretty well. So those are 3 things we have for you so far. 3 is a better number than 2. We have what do you notice and remember about your hometown? What do you notice and remember about yourself and the things you like? What do you notice and remember about media? Really, what we're saying here is being a dungeon master is a lifelong pursuit, and then it's something you could always be getting better at. And if you want to get better at specific things, like doing character voices or building maps, all that kind of, or building really complex, detailed societies, there are other channels for that, and those are skills you can hone. But just knowing that your everyday life and the way that you live it, and the experiences you experience. God damn, it's 4 a.m. That kind of jazz is more useful than you might think, because injecting a little bit of yourself and particularly how you see the world into your campaign, little bits are going to leak in anyway. So it's you can't avoid it. You might as well lean into it, and you can get a lot of interesting things. I realize now that man, you're probably not going to get the kind of game that I run from anyone else. That's true of all Dungeon Masters when they develop a style, and consciously leaning into the things you enjoy and the way you see things is a great way to develop your style further, or if you're just starting out, to get one in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. It can just lead to a great sense of pride and accomplishment. Oh no. It can just lead to you having a unique experience that you get to share with around this table of, friends, and it can just be a lovely time knowing that nobody else in the world could have done it the way you did it just there, just now.
So I think that's probably us for now. 3 quick tips, and us talking way too much about my hometown, the place where I grew up. Please cyberstalk the mayor. Towns in Ireland don't even have mayors, so you can't. It was a joke. It was a joke.
Some of them do.
Oh, well, Greg doesn't. I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
I'd know about it.
Maybe the counties have mayors. Look, even we don't really understand.
Dublin apparently is a Lord Mayor.
Is that like a
Who knows?
mayor of mayors?
If you somehow enjoyed this rambling nonsense, you can chat with us directly in our Discord. You can leave a comment below. You could follow us on Twitter. If you got to this point, you're probably interested in subscribing. I mean, this is definitely some of our worst content. Anyway, thanks for listening. Hopefully that was useful. If you do end up intentionally and consciously putting a bit more of yourself into your games, feel free to let us know. I mean, the whole reason we have this whole channel is because we've got some stuff to say, yes, but we also love hearing the stuff you guys come up with in response. It's just a lot of fun to have had a little bit of an impact on the world. So, like, we do read all the comments. I respond to almost all the comments. Anyway, sorry. Ramble. Have a good one. I hope you guys are all staying safe in this trying time. Peace.
And I'm still Jack.